And I'm talking with Darrell Whitman, who we have interviewed before. He's a whistleblower at the OSHA Whistleblower Protection Program, and he was retaliated for defending really whistleblowers at Test America, FedEx, Wells Fargo, and many other places. So welcome to WorkWeek Radio. So Darrell, you've been involved in not only defending yourself, but you've discovered that there are many whistleblowers in the federal government who have been retaliated as well by the inspector generals in the U.S. government. And you now have information that they've been conspiring really to really not protect the whistleblowers and doing proper oversight, but themselves have been conspiring to prevent oversight.
Yeah, there's, it's as I said earlier, it's not necessarily a large group of people, but it's a very dedicated group of people, and they now keep positions in the federal government and are able to manipulate the system, and their objective is to protect senior responsible management officials, often political appointees, from accountability for wrongdoing. It's a protection racket, in effect, and the way they do that is by ensuring that charges against these officials are never investigated. You can kind of see that in the data that we've gathered from Government Accountability Office audits. Classic was the one last year of the Office of Special Counsel, which showed that of the complaints that were brought to them by federal whistleblowers, and there were between 2011 and 2016, there were about 8,000 complaints, roughly speaking. So they get an average of about 1,500 complaints a year. Of these complaints, as the audit shows, there were only 0.8 timely investigations, and there were only 3.5% investigations of any kind of reports about wrongdoing by federal officials. So if you imagine, these complaints would involve everyone from a local supervisor to, as in my case, the former Secretary of Labor, Thomas Perez. You can imagine those 0.8% that got a timely investigation were most likely complaints against some local official, because the rest of them, they just never happens. It's a little like what I discovered when I was working with OSHA, that OSHA has a very similar record of not conducting credible investigations except in a small minority of cases. In OSHA's case, it was less than 2%. So those 2% represents, small companies, often, they're kind of mom and pop operations or very small companies, and they like to beat them over the head, make a big public spectacle out of that they are charged and been found to have violated whistleblower rights. But if you look at the major corporations, there's only a very, very small group of cases in OSHA that were brought against major corporations that ever saw the light of day. And in those cases, there was one against Bank of America. And I happen to know that case because I know the investigator for the case. The only reason it got to OSHA in the first place was it's mandated by law that you go there, number one. But this was a complaint by a high-level official within the Bank of America who had access to a lot of resources, including legal resources. So it was not a case that OSHA could really hide, because they were going to be the spotlight was on. They had to do something, and eventually they did do an investigation, etc. But that was one of those very, very rare cases. And considering that OSHA gets about 1,500 to 2,000 cases a year, and you think about you can count on one hand the number of major corporations who've had to answer a complaint, you can see how corrupt that system is.
And we actually interviewed Jacinda Guitron, covered her complaint against Wells Fargo Bank. She was complaining about being coerced to open up fake bank accounts. This is in Napa and St. Helena.
Right.
And Kamala Harris was the California Attorney General at that point, who could have been investigating Wells Fargo for illegal activities. it seems like in that was that case, and then there was the situation at Hunters Point Shipyard and Treasure Island where you were investigating the case of whistleblower Michael Madry, who said that the tests were being falsified by Test America on asbestos there, and you were retaliated there by your supervisor, who was also a lawyer.
Yes, I think what people need to understand is this is not a matter of a few bad apples. This is a systemic organization of a criminal conspiracy, in fact. People in high places within the government who have been using their offices to accomplish this protection racket. And there's connections outside of the federal government, with as you now know, with the Government Accountability Project and other supposedly pro-whistleblower groups who've actually been working to conceal the wrongdoing in the federal government, not actually exposing it. But what we've learned is there are certain places in the federal government that are very important to control if you want to protect high-level officials. And this group of people have managed to capture, in effect, these positions and to hold them and use them as ways of obstructing investigations. It's sort of like a defense in layers. So you go to OSHA, you run into the corruption in OSHA, you appeal the corruption in OSHA to another administrative agency, and that agency turns out to be corrupt as well. And you just keep going up the ladder, and it seems like an endless string of corruption until you start to get near the top. And that's when you begin to see this is a systemic system of corruption. And you begin to see the individuals involved in ensuring that none of these investigations ever sees the light of day.
And the inspector generals, there's 77 agencies. These inspector generals, apparently they've been conspiring, according to some of your reports, to organize to prevent investigations and protection of whistleblowers.
It doesn't mean that all 77 of them are corrupt, but certainly the ones in the major agencies where there's a high level of political interest, like the Department of Defense, the security agencies, the Department of Interior, which handles a lot of resource, stuff. The Department of Labor, surprisingly, is a major target because it is the place where workers are supposed to be represented, and workers have now become the front line in trying to protect the public health and safety. So if what you're doing is putting the public health and safety at risk, you would want to control the Department of Labor and ensure that none of these complaints against your allies, or you can describe these people, but to protect the major corporations that are involved in criminal activity. So it's there's different small agencies involved here, and it's very, very well crafted. And what that should tell everyone is, if it's so well crafted, and it's been persistent, and it's been around for at least 8, 9, 10 years, if not longer, I suspect, if the truth be known, and it goes back a couple of decades. But when you see it in its full flower as these very specific agencies with people embedded in these agencies to basically block investigations, you begin to understand how the corruption can spread and has spread throughout the federal government.
We're talking with Darrell Whitman. He's a former federal OSHA investigator and lawyer with the Whistleblower Protection Program, and he's engaged in an effort to, with other whistleblowers in the federal government, to get some accountability in the fact that these inspector generals, many of them, not all, have been colluding really to prevent the protection of whistleblowers, even in the federal government, who have been defending whistleblowers in the different agencies, including we talked about Hunters Point and the shipyard and Treasure Island. We did a program last week about it, and we discovered that Gavin Newsom, who was mayor of San Francisco and now governor, just gave a contract to Tetra Tech. And people have to ask, our listeners probably ask, how could it be that a company where the executives, some of the lower level management executives are in prison, are getting continue to get contracts? I would assume that that's the case in the federal government in many agencies.
Yes, and that's exactly the point. This corruption has become a culture of corruption, as I identified it years ago, too many years ago, where it has corrupted the middle layer of management. If you work in the federal government and you watch people that get promoted to positions of importance, you're like anyone. You want to advance in your career. You want to advance in your position. And what they've done is they made appointments, even hiring, conditional on whether you're seen as someone who will cooperate with the corruption. So you may not even be aware of that at all, and a lot of people aren't when they first go into the federal government. But if you look carefully and you watch, you'll see, what are the criteria for promotion? Well, the criteria for promotion is that you're playing ball with senior management, which means you don't bring up any problems. It becomes a self-reinforcing censorship of reporting. And in spite of that, we still see, in terms of the Office of Special Counsel, 1,500 or more complaints a year, and those are the formal ones, the ones we know about. And, more recently, we've seen reports that up to 100,000 employees in the Department of Defense are filing complaints or trying to complain every year. So the corruption has gotten very, very broad, deep, and it's now operating almost in the open with some of these agencies, and that's what you see with sweetheart contracting and
even the Boeing, the oversight of Boeing, where Boeing was.
It's almost shocking when you think about it. When you have the FAA, who is supposed to be regulating the airline industry, the air carriers, for the public safety, health and safety, and then they're admitting that, we're just letting Boeing self-regulate. Well, you can't do that. That's basically saying we're not paying any attention to the law. We're not going to act as a gatekeeper to protect the public interest.
And of course, nobody's calling for criminal prosecution, both of the FAA officials and the Boeing officials, for allowing this criminality.
But again, it's become so embedded. The corruption has become so embedded, and it's developed this culture that a lot of these officials, and it's shocking when you read it, they don't think that they're subject to the law. I just read an audit that was done by the Inspector General, the Department of Labor Inspector General of OSHA in 2015, and what they quoted actually right in the document was interviewing senior members of OSHA about, why aren't you completing these investigations in a timely manner? Every investigation, whistleblower investigation, has a time frame. They're supposed to be conducted in 30, 60, 90 days, 180 days, depending on what the statute says. But there's a really good reason for that. That is, the idea of investigating is to produce enough evidence to say to the regulatory agency, because OSHA is not, strictly speaking, a regulatory agency, but to give a report to the FAA or to the SEC or to the Department of Interior or wherever, and say, look, we had a whistleblower, we reviewed his case, it met the minimum standards for that. It looks like there's real fire here and not just smoke, and you need to do an investigation. And in the meantime, the law is supposed to protect the whistleblower. None of that is happening. They're not protecting the whistleblower. They're not giving timely notice to the regulatory agencies to take action to protect the public. And if you think about how much of your life involves relying on, some form of health and safety protection by government, you should be very, very concerned. Virtually everything you do, from your place you work to where you travel, how you travel, to the food that you eat, to the health care that you get, to the roads that you travel on, these all rely on a system of regulation to promote health and safety. And if those systems are not working, I mean, I think I'd barricade myself inside my apartment and never go out.
It is clear that this is a life and threat danger to people, and of course the people that were killed by Boeing because of their criminal malfeasance, and the criminal malfeasance really of the FAA is completely covered up, and neither Democrat or Republican in Congress are calling for criminal prosecution of Boeing for illegal activities.
Well, the corruption is bipartisan.
Okay, well, I want to thank you for joining us on KPFA WorkWeek Radio, and we will be covering this and following this up. Thanks for joining us on WorkWeek Radio.